Well, then I will start. I will start by saying a few things. Number one, there's a common mythology that if you're going to do mastering, you have to go to a mastering engineer. Now, that's true in many respects. And I differentiate mastering into two types of mastering. Mastering with a capital M and mastering with a small m. If you have a mission critical CD that you've spent the last 2 years working on and you don't know how to master, then you should probably go to a mastering engineer. In fact, I would highly recommend it. And if you are going to go to a mastering engineer, I will tell you how to make that mastering engineer fall in love with you. You give them a track that has headroom, like about 6 dB or so, and you also make sure that you add no processing to the master stereo output. You don't add dynamics, you don't add limiting, you don't add EQ, you don't add anything. You give them the best balance you can from the mix. You give them some headroom, and they will look at you and go, wow, this guy knows what he's doing. I better do a really good job. Okay? So that's one thing. I have a friend, Steve Turnage, who does mastering, and one of the best lines I think he ever said was, mastering engineers turn lead into gold. They're like alchemists. You want to give the mastering engineer pure lead, not fake gold. Okay? I get a lot of stuff that's faux mastered and I have to fix it. That's the worst kind of mastering to do because it's basically like, hi, we've already painted it chrome. You know, so we'd like you to paint it white. And it's like, I don't know how I'm ever going to cover up over that chrome. So that's something about mastering. Now, the other differentiation I make with big M mastering and small M mastering is there's a lot of times when you need to do mastering, but you maybe don't want to have to spend $600 or a couple grand for like a really hardcore mastering engineer. You've made a recording of your live gig and you want to be able to master it. You've done narration for something and you want to master it. You're doing a video soundtrack. And the main thing is the video, but you want the audio to be good, so you want it to be decent, but again, you have budget constraints or whatever. In cases like that, it's worth giving it a shot yourself. Now, mastering, no one was born a mastering engineer. No one came out of the hospital, you know, with a compressor issued to them. You have to learn, you have to start somewhere. Probably the first time you try to master, if what you end up with sounds better than the mix, you're on the right path. If it sounds worse than the mix, go back to the mastering engineer, okay? But if the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. And I'll tell you what the most important components of mastering are. Number one is the room and the monitors, because you have to have a true idea of what's going on, okay? You need to have an accurate representation. And frankly, I will tell you that it is possible to master with headphones if you learn them. It's not the preferred way, but it sure gets rid of reflections. It sure gets rid of speaker issues and all that. I do a lot of reality checks on headphones for mastering, and now it's gotten to the point where that's become my primary way of mastering because I can hear so much detail, little crackles or little things that you might not hear, and then I use the speakers as the reality check. And that, you know, what's it going to sound like loud? What's it going to sound like in stereo? What's it going to sound like in mono? What's it going to sound like in a room? What's it going to sound like in a bad room? All that. That's number one. Number two is your ears. This is very critical listening. And the thing I like to explain to people, if you're first starting out with mastering, whatever change you make, cut it in half. If you think something needs 3 dB at 4K hertz, set it to 1.5. Learn to live with it. Because think about it for a second. If you have 24 tracks and you add a dB to the drum track, you're really probably not going to hear much of a change. But if you add 1 dB to your stereo mix, you're essentially adding 1 dB to every single track in the mix. And so there's also Newton's law is also coming into play. For every action, there's an equal opposite reaction. If you increase the treble, the bass seems less, the mid-range seems less. If you notch the mid-range, the bass and the treble seem more. So you really have to be very careful and realize that very subtle changes are what's happening. If you're making changes of 2 or 3 dB, you're probably either not mastering right or it was mixed terribly, one or the other. So you need to be subtle. So those are some basic things about mastering. I'll tell you one more thing that's a personal preference about mastering. You want to do the least amount of stuff possible. You really, every time, people will argue with me about this, and you're certainly welcome to, but I feel every time you add a processor, you're giving it something, but you're also taking something away. So you don't want to do anything more than you really have to. You don't want to limit the crap out of it. You don't want to like add tons of EQ. You just really don't need to do that. I mean, there are some situations where maybe a little bit of reverb will help glue things together or whatever. There are some instances where a little bus compression is good. Now, let's talk about Studio One Pro, which I'm sure will make them happy because they're the ones who have me here. This is the project page in Studio One Pro where you can assemble cuts in different ways. And one of the nice things about it is that it's very easy to try different orders. Like for example, suppose I think that maybe this cut would be better later on. I can move it around, everything follows along and rearranges. You don't have to go back and change the position of everything else. So let's suppose I really think that I want this mazurka in G major as the starting cut. There it is. Everything's right there exactly where I need it. And the other thing is you can put in track markers. You can determine where the track markers are going to go. You can add them wherever you want. So like in a live recording where you have one continuous thing, you can put the track markers in between the songs so that you can jump to the different songs and all that. But the coolest thing about this page is that if you're working on a project in a song in Studio One Pro, and I have a bogus one here we can look at. In most cases, let's say you're putting an album together and you've got all your songs, you've got all your cuts together, they're all happening, and then you realize that the one that you cut in last October, the vocals were too low. In most cases, in fact, in every case that I know of, you would now have to go back to that program, remix that song, raise the vocal up, rebounce it to a 2-track, bring it into your CD assembly program, make sure it's all right, put it in properly because the length may have changed, you're fading out a little differently or whatever. You don't have to do that with Studio One Pro. What's totally cool about it is you can just drag the project, you can just drag the song into your project window, and in this column on the left, if there's been a change to the song, it will have a little red dot next to it, which means this is different than what you had in the original, and then you can just say remix the sucker. And it'll remix it right then and there on that page, so you can hear it in context in just a matter of seconds. That to me is huge. I think that that's a really, really big deal, and it's one of my favorite features of the program. Okay, now, let's listen to some of the effects that mastering can do. Let's listen to some of the changes it can do. And again, I'm sorry about the critical listening environment. You can all put on your virtual earphones so you can actually hear it. But I'm going to play you a song that came to me from a lady named Sandra Palmer, and I really like this song. She's a songwriter from Florida, and I thought it was a great song, but you're about to hear that it has several deficiencies.
If you could live your life all over, what would you regret? Would your remorse make any difference? Would you just as soon forget? I'd like to think that I'd be sincere, stronger and kinder too. But if I'm honest.
Okay, so let me play the other version. I'm sorry, I had them reversed because I changed the order. This is the one that came to me, and the first thing you can see is in the phase meter, that's very close to a straight line. That means that it's basically mono. You asked about the widening. There's like virtually no stereo information there at all. Do you hear any? The guitar has no snap. The drums have no pop. There's like nothing going on. It's very flat. Her voice is also a little bit too loud, I think, for the track. But that's okay, because we can take the track, expand it in stereo, leave a space for her voice, add some EQ, and give some snap to the instrument. So let's compare that with the mastered version. Now that guitar pops. And now the drums are all of a sudden, you can actually hear that there's hi-hats going on. And we have real stereo. And notice how the voice now sits in the track a lot better because we've expanded it out. So in case anybody doubts that mastering can make a difference, there it is. So what did I do to it? Stereo widening is really easy to do. There are two places you can add effects in Studio One Pro. You can add them for individual tracks. when you highlight the track, you can see what's in there. And you can also add overall effects that affect every single track. Like I have the phase meter as the master so I can see it on everything. But if you wanted to add a little bit of limiting on the entire album, or let's say you recorded it in a place where there was a resonance, it's a live recording and there's a room resonance, you can put a notch filter that deals with all the cuts or whatever. So the thing that you use for widening in Studio One Pro is called Binaural Pan. And see this control that says width? It's now wider. It's now narrower. It's that simple. It's that simple. And you can check it in mono to make sure that there's nothing weird going on. But this is like an instant way to make things wider. It's just incredibly useful that way. All right, now listen to another example. Here's a song that was given to me, and it was faux mastered. And what you can see on this track, I hope you can see it there, notice that there was DC offset on it. And so the whole thing was shifted up. And as a result, the compressor couldn't get an accurate read on what was happening with the song because it didn't know what the real values were as it was compressing. And so that was one problem. And what ended up happening was that the drums lost all their punch because half of the cycle was being compressed more than the other half. And as I said, it had been attempted to be mastered. So it was what I had to do was fix it. So let's listen to this. This is a song that was done by a group called Overshine. It has Brian Hardgroove from Public Enemy. We have a band together, and this is another one of his projects. And now, to me, those drums sound like they're hitting a pillow. Here, that's kind of muffled. You're just really not getting anything. And the guitars are very undifferentiated. They're just kind of like in this general sort of sludge. Okay, this is what happens when you add too much compression. And in this case, we have the opposite problem that we had before. There's not enough vocal. We need to bring all that out. And here's the mastered version. Okay, now you can really hear the guitars. They're really coming out. The drums have a lot more pop.
I can't swear what's true, but I believe in you.
Okay, so your question is, how the heck did he do that? EQ. To me, again, you'll have a lot of people arguing with this. To me, 90% of mastering is EQ. 5% is dynamics, 5% is everything else in terms of the gear that you add. If you have your EQ down, if you have your EQ figured out, you're talking about order of things, it's real simple. Put the EQ on first, get everything EQ'd properly, add a little bit of dynamics, or actually add a little bit of widening if that's necessary, or any other treatments, reverb, things like that. Throw your limiting on the end and you're done. Now let me give you a couple clues about that whole limiting thing. We all know about the Loudness Wars, right? Everybody here knows about the Loudness Wars? Yes, no? Anybody not know about the Loudness Wars? Okay. What this means is that sometime in I guess it was in the late 80s, someone decided that the louder a song was, the better. And they decided that this whole thing about dynamics being a necessary emotional component of music was like, nah, that's crazy talk. We don't need dynamics, you know? So, and now there was a couple reasons for this. One is that if you have two things side by side that are identical, but one's a little bit louder than the other, people will perceive it as better. This was a trick that was used by stereo salesmen back in the day when you went into, like, you know, a stereo store and they were getting a really big commission on this set of speakers and not a big commission on this set of speakers. They'd set them up side by side and they'd make the speaker on which they got the commission just a couple dB louder. So it hit a sweeter part of the Fletcher-Munson curve, and you'd think it was louder and better. So the other reason for making cuts really loud was for DJs, because they're transitioning from one song to another. You couldn't have huge volume changes. That just wasn't practical, okay? So that created what's called the Loudness Wars, which is, my song's louder than your song. No, my song's louder than your song. Oh, I'm going to make it even louder. The problem is that leads to ear fatigue. You lose dynamics, and as adults, we are all capable of turning up a volume control if we want it louder by volume control, I mean a knob that makes it louder. If you want it louder, make it louder, okay? So, I recently had a client named Troy Castellano. I love his band. He's got a three-piece out of the Midwest, and he wanted it to be as loud as possible. Now, 90% of the time, when I have a client who wants a really loud song, I say, okay, I'll do your version, but then I'm also going to do the version that I want to hear, and no extra charge, and you can choose whichever one you want. 90% of the time, they choose the one that I like. I have several techniques to make cuts louder. One is to reduce individual peaks, so I can normalize the whole thing up. Like, suppose most of your music is sitting at -6, but you have a few peaks sticking up. If you reduce just those peaks, just those half cycles by 6 dB, now you can raise the whole thing up by 6 dB. You haven't messed with the dynamics. But the main trick that I'm going to show you now is how you can win the loudness wars without bloodshed. So here's what he sent me. You can already see it doesn't really have a lot of dynamics.
I ain't gonna get out of bed today. I'm gonna pull the covers over my head. I call him sick to the prick who makes me feel like the walking dead.
Okay, now here's the mastered version. And remember, you wanted it as loud as possible.
I ain't gonna get out of bed today. I'm gonna pull the cover.
But notice, listen to the difference in the drums for just a second. And you'll hear that the drums, even on the sausage version, I call it sausage because it looks like a sausage now, okay. Even on the sausage version, the drums still have punch. You still feel them in your gut. The guitar still comes in. The vocal still comes in louder. So actually, those drums sound more compressed than after it was mastered and compressed even more. How is it possible to compress something more and have it have more dynamics? Anybody? Pardon me? Multiband. No, actually not. But multiband compression is a beautiful thing. What I have really gotten into is putting two compressors in series at very low ratios, like 1.2 to 1, followed by another one at 1.2 to 1. And what it does is it gives you really good compression, but it doesn't give you that compression effect because you're not really hitting the compressor very hard. So as a result, even though you're getting compression, you're still retaining the dynamics. Yes, question. I'm sorry? Okay, what kind of gain reduction? Like I said, with the compression like 1.2 to 1, 1.3 to 1. You'll see a lot of people use like 4 to 1, 5 to 1. But then you hear the artifacts of the compression. You hear the pumping, and the compressor can't react fast enough. That's where you lose the dynamics. Because even with a look-ahead compressor, there's a finite amount of time before that kicks in. With the very light compression, the attack is instantaneous. So now you've brought up that attack. Okay, so now you've done your EQ. You've raised the upper mids maybe a little bit to make those thwacks and those vocal sounds come out, which is also a lot of this. I'm like, there's a little lifted around 3 or 4K. You've got the series compressors, and then you add a little bit of limiting at the end, or what Waves calls maximization, but it's basically limiting. But now, instead of adding 4 or 5 or even 9 dB of limiting, which I've seen on some masters, which is actually technically should be illegal, but you only need to add maybe 2 dB of limiting to shave those peaks. And so between the reduction of the peaks in the beginning, being able to bring the level of the whole thing up, adding EQ to add some snap to everything, the light compression, and a little bit of limiting at the end, we've won the loudness wars without bloodshed. Okay? So yes. And now we have dynamics, which people really do respond to. Now let me see how I'm doing time-wise. If you hold on one second. Okay. You're asking about order. I think I pretty much covered that. But let me explain one more thing about album assembly. And that is that when people talk about mastering, they hardly ever talk about the assembly process, which is a big part of mastering. And the other thing they don't talk about is why mastering exists in the first place. And it's important to know this. We are now going to take a trip down memory lane, and I'm going to explain to you how we got here and what it means. It used to be that the process of mastering was designed to compensate for deficiencies in the playback medium. In other words, we had these really nice studios, 24-track studios. We had beautiful rooms, wonderful mic collections, Neumann mics, consoles, outboard gear, wonderful stuff. But then it all had to be siphoned, funneled down into vinyl, which has like no bass response, has an EQ curve that's just outrageous. I don't know if you've ever looked at an RIA curve, but it's like a huge bass boost, huge treble cut. You know, I mean, it was just like a horrible thing to deal with. There was inner groove distortion, which meant that the inner grooves had more distortion than the outer ones, so you had to put your quiet songs there. You had a window of how much space you could have on an album, because the louder it was, the smaller the grooves had to be. So if you wanted an album with 25 minutes on a side, it all of a sudden became very soft. And to add insult to injury, people nowadays look back on vinyl and they say, well, that was a more natural way to do things. Yeah, right. Dragging a rock through many yards of plastic and then equalizing the living daylights out of it, natural. Yeah, baby. Okay. So that's what mastering was about. And then some idiot had the idea to turn a dictation medium into a playback thing called a cassette. So now there was another set of constraints because high-speed duplication sucked. And anyway, so all these things. So mastering engineers had very difficult tasks. They had to make this perfect balance. The cutting lathe had to be able to cope with the grooves. The bass had to be done in a certain way. Everything had to be done a certain way. Now, fast forward 2 decades. We're now in the 21st century. Excuse me. I'm looking forward. Yeah, you know where I live. Anyway, the thing that mastering does now, in a lot of cases, and it sort of pains me to say this, it compensates for deficiencies in the recording process in order to sound good with a playback medium that's extremely accurate. So you're seeing more people recording stuff at home, more stuff in rooms that are kind of funky, more rooms that have resonances, and that's one thing that you'll find happening a lot. So that's one thing about mastering. What we want to do is we want to take whatever we get, make it the best we can, make it the most wonderful sounding thing we can. And the other thing that I personally try to do as a mastering engineer is not put my stamp on it. I don't want anybody to be ever to be able to listen to something I've mastered and say, oh, well, that's a Craig Anderton master. You know, the whole object is to bring the artist out. So as far as the assembly process is concerned, this is a lost art as well, because you really need to think about it. Do you want three songs in a row with the same tempo or the same key? How do you want to vary the tempo? Do you want to start off slow and go fast? Do you want to start off fast, bring it down? That's a whole emotional component. And if you ever can't decide how to assemble an album, go find a DJ. Their whole thing is how to put stuff together in an order that manipulates the crowd in a certain way. And they can really help you out with this kind of thing. So it's a good thing to know. Now, in our waning minutes, let me call up a different project here. And let's actually take a song and let's fix some things that are wrong with it. And this is a song how do I find it? Where's the desktop? There's desktop, okay. This is a song by a guy named, I believe, Jeff Moore, one of your PreSonus guys, or a friend of PreSonus or something. Anyway, let's listen to it and see what needs to be done.
Change, it's changing all around. I know the reasons you've arranged, you're tearing me down. Where is the peacefulness of mine? Where will my heart come back to life? I'm alright.
Okay, what do you hear that's wrong with it? I'd say it's kind of muffled. I'd say we're lacking snap, we're lacking dynamics on the drums and things like that. So one of the easiest things we can do, let's take that song, let's stick an EQ on there, and let's give it just a little bit of lift. Let's see. Let's give it just a little bit of lift where the vocal intelligence or vocal articulation sits, which would be around, say, 4 kHz or so. Let's keep listening.
Pick up the pieces that are left of me. I'm alright.
You can hear what those frequencies are. If we take them away, you lose all the snap. It becomes super muffled.
But know I will always have this too. A little piece of you.
Now, I'm not real happy with that guitar. To me, it's kind of whiny. It doesn't have any substance to it. So what we're going to do, and now this is a very important technique. I'm showing it to you on guitar, but this relates to a lot of things with mastering. First of all, let's take off that lift that we gave it so it's easier to hear. And here's something that's probably my most used mastering technique, which is to create an extremely sharp peak, sweep it, and find resonances that sound extremely sharp. This happens with amp sims, this happens with rooms that have resonances, and we'll find what it is with this guitar. So I've looped this section here.
How could we let this slip away?
That's the frequency. That's the bad frequency.
Could we let this slip away?
Now it's completely gone. Let's bring it back. Much more even.
Let this slip
Okay, now as you can see, it's really not a whole lot of cut there, but it's just enough to make a difference. Now let's see how that interferes with our high frequency lift that we gave it before.
Could we let this slip away?
We're still okay. All right, now let's widen it.
Could we let this slip away? Slipping through my hands. Back in the darkness.
Hear how that opens it up, opens up the sound stage.
Bring back the
And again,
light. Where is the pleasure in the pain? Where is my shelter in the rain?
and there's the mono. Big difference.
Well, I'm alright as I pick up the pieces.
All right, now let's throw a little bit of limiting on there. Actually, I would have just EQ'd a little bit. That peak's a little bit high for my taste.
I'll be fine. Cleaning up the corner, put it back in order.
Okay, now I'm not going to do the dual compression thing because he didn't ask for the loudest song possible, but let me show you what a little bit of limiting can do for this as well. We'll bring the limiter up.
But no, I will always have this too. A little piece of you.
And the guitar's still obnoxious, so we'll bring that down a little more.
Help me
Whoops.
dry on my tears and help me lay on my fears and help me, I think I am falling. Does anybody hear me calling? Help me dry on my tears.
Okay, now let's take all those
help
processors
me lay
out.
on my fears and help me, I think I am falling. Does anybody hear
Big
me
difference,
calling?
right?
I'm alright as I pick up the pieces.
I love
that
this
are
song.
left of me. I'm alright.
But I love it a lot more this way.
I'll be fine.
Okay, I'm going to give you one last tip. Do I have time for one last tip? I mean, I'm not Teddy Riley, but I can go over a minute, right? Okay. I'm going to show you one more thing. The level meter here. Very welcome. The last thing I'm going to tell you about is I mentioned having headroom earlier. Why do you want headroom? It's digital, right? Why do we need headroom? This is an analog. I'll tell you why. Because meters, not here, but meters in the real world are measuring the levels of samples to tell you what the signal level is. You know how samples work, digital audio, we sample, okay? Here's the thing. A digital audio signal doesn't look like that when it comes out of your speakers. It goes through smoothing filters that round off those samples and create an analog waveform. If you have two samples right here, there's a very good chance that when it's reconstructed, the signal's going to make an arc on top of them. And it's actually going to be higher than what the samples indicate. That's called intersample distortion. So if you have your headroom where your meters are showing 0, and I hear this all the time, Craig, there can't be any distortion. My meter showed it was 0. Then you can almost be sure there was distortion because it wasn't catching things. Now the level meter here, there's a special level meter you can put in the master, and it will actually read any intersample problems that you have. Okay, enable that and you can see it. Now this is properly mastered, of course, so we don't have that problem, but I will boost the level artificially and you'll see what I mean. Now notice, well, it clipped just now when I turned it off, but just before I turned it off, if you notice, the clipping light was not on, but the red bands were, which meant that a normal meter would have said you're not clipping, but the intersample meters show that you were clipping, and they also show you how much above it is. So that's something else that's really useful to know. So what have we learned today? We've learned that mastering makes a big difference, that you can do it yourself, but you better keep doing it a lot so you get good at it. And if you can't, you should go to a professional mastering engineer, of which not all of them are good. So make sure you listen to their stuff. We've learned if you're going to give something to a mastering engineer, don't put processing on it. We've learned how to win the volume wars without bloodshed, EQ frequencies to make a difference, how to widen stuff, how to avoid intersample distortion, and why we had to have mastering in the first place for vinyl and things like that. And so if you have any other questions, what you want to do is go to my Sound Studio and Stage forum on harmonycentral.com and go in there and say, hey, I was at your PreSonus thing, I got a question for you, and I'll be more than happy to answer it. Thank you for coming. You've been a great audience, and I'll be doing the same thing tomorrow.